But any questions bothered you, this is the forum for it. Any question you've been asked, no question is off limits. So tonight there is a presentation, but we're dedicating half of the time to your questions. So be thinking of them, be noting them down and bring them, and you can, just put your hand up or get your friend to ask it if you're too shy to do it yourself. Okay, so we want your questions. We don't want the last part this evening to just be a quiet lull. And afterwards, you can get Justin's books at the back, and if you want a book signing, Justin will sign it for you. Okay, enough of me. I'm going to hand over to Justin Brierley. Let's give him a warm welcome for coming out to Aylesbury tonight.
Wow. Thank you so much. What a lovely welcome I've had already here in Aylesbury. It's wonderful to be with you all. So again, what a delight to be able to as well chair not just this evening, but these future conversations on a more or less monthly basis. And I'm really looking forward to the one that we've already heard about in October with Sir Colin Humphreys. But do put those in your diary, those forthcoming conversations. They're all on the flyer, I believe, because I think this will be an amazing year in which we really get to dig into some really interesting minds and stories and come to understand better the evidence that is there for the Christian faith and what has led various different people to embrace it themselves. I'll be sort of giving a little bit of an idea of why I am a Christian tonight, because I've spent a lot of my career talking to people about why they don't believe. To atheists, agnostics, people without faith. People who came on a show that I founded about 17 and a half years ago called Unbelievable, in which we were essentially asking Christians and non-Christians to sit down together for dialogue and debate. I wanted to find out whether the Christian story could stand on its own 2 feet, because sometimes it's been possible to live in a Christian bubble and to sort of avoid some of those conversations that are out there. But I think it's been increasingly difficult to do that in the last couple of decades at least. We're often only a Google click away from radical skepticism. And I'm going to be talking tonight about a particular movement that came on the scene in the mid-2000s, around the time my show started, called New Atheism, and some of the objections and questions that raised around Christianity. But I hope that, as Sam said, whatever you get out of this evening's presentation, that it'll leave you hopefully with some answers, but I hope it'll generate some questions as well. And I'm really looking forward to whatever may come to mind towards the end of the evening as you think of those questions. Do ask them towards the end. I think the plan is there'll be a sort of a few minute break between me speaking and the Q&A, but it'll be great to be able to field some of those questions later. So I have a new book out. And as Sam kindly mentioned, it will be available afterwards. But I begin this book, it's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, quoting a poem by Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold was a Victorian poet, and he wrote this in, I think it was 1867. It was called Dover Beach. And he wrote it while walking along Dover Beach and seeing the tide go out. And this is what he wrote: "The sea of faith," well, I think we've got it on screen as well. "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." And in his day, that sea of faith and its melancholy, long withdrawing roar stood for Matthew Arnold for the incursion of secularism, the view that actually there is no God, and that science and reason and technology, which was all blossoming in the Victorian era, was sort of replacing the need for God. Now, if you accelerate 150 years from that time to today, that's only continued to advance. We live in a very post-Christian world where many people simply have never had any church experience, let alone believing in God. And that sea of faith that in his day Matthew Arnold saw going out, you could say it's gone out even further. And that may be the story that a lot of people in our world, in the West, have. They think Christianity is kind of eventually going to simply recede into nothing, that there's probably going to be just the death of God, the death of the church, the decline of religion generally. But I had a conversation a few years ago with someone that sort of made me rethink this. His name is Douglas Murray. Got a picture of him on the screen. And Douglas Murray is not a Christian, but he describes himself as a Christian atheist. I found that interesting. It's a bit of a contradiction in terms, but what he means by that is he doesn't believe in Christianity, but he's not satisfied with atheism either. Because atheism, the view that there's no God, he realised it doesn't buy you meaning or purpose or value. And what he realised is that actually the Christian story, which for generations before had informed people's lives, that really was where he did get his morality and his purpose and a lot of meaning from. So he was this sort of, as he called himself, unsatisfied agnostic. And referencing Matthew Arnold's poem about the sea of faith going out, he said, well, the thing about the sea is that it could come back in again. That is the point of tides. And I thought, you know what? Douglas Murray has a point there. And he was noticing among some of his contemporary peers that actually some of them were, believe it or not, becoming Christians. Some thinking, intelligent people had actually decided to convert to Christianity. And Douglas wondered, maybe, Justin, we're living in a moment where people are ready to hear that story again. Maybe we're ready for the turning of the tide. And that's really at the centre of my book. I think that actually we are approaching a moment in our culture where people are perhaps ready to hear the Christian story again, where the sea of faith, as it recedes, has perhaps reached its furthest ebb. That the secular story of reality, the material story of reality is running out of steam, and that in various ways I was noticing our culture was starting to take the Christian story seriously again. Something that had convinced me of this was that the nature of the conversations I was having on my Unbelievable show were changing significantly. Got another slide after this one. The Unbelievable show was this format where I sat down with a Christian and a non-Christian to debate whether God exists. If you could go back to the previous slide, thank you. And this was really a show that began in the heyday of what, as I said earlier, has been termed the new atheism. These four gentlemen on the screen were often called the four horsemen of the new atheism. This was a very anti-religious movement that arose in around the mid-2000s. And on the screen there, you can see from left to right, Richard Dawkins, who was really the leader of this movement, a biologist who wrote a best-selling book called The God Delusion, which essentially said, religion is fairy tales and we need science and reason to replace it. And alongside him is Sam Harris, a neuroscientist and public thinker, Christopher Hitchens, a popular journalist and sort of polemicist from the UK, and Daniel Dennett. They each had their own best-selling anti-God book. And the new atheism was very much a movement that was catalysed by these four people and eventually led to all kinds of rallies and online conferences, even an advertising campaign here in the UK. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but in 2009, if you were in London, you could have seen red London buses emblazoned with the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So this new atheist movement was a real cultural moment, and there were a lot of people who were being persuaded. It was quite sloganeering. It used a lot of ridicule and mockery as well, a lot of memes and online stuff that kind of essentially took the mickey out of Christianity and said, you know, being a religious person is essentially fairy tales and wishful thinking. Well, that was a really interesting moment to begin these conversations between Christians and non-Christians. And the tone of the conversations often matched the kind of bombastic rhetoric that was going on in those new atheist circles. So we would have these, you know, quite full-on debates between new atheist type people and Christian thinkers. And it was a lot of fun at the time. But what I noticed as the years went on was that the tone of the conversations began to change. More and more, the atheists who I was inviting onto the show were distinguishing themselves from this new atheism. They were saying, well, I'm not really a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist. It seemed like they wanted to perhaps sort of tone down that kind of way of looking at non-belief. In fact, in many ways, the new atheism became sort of quasi-religious in its own way. You could say it had its, you know, four high priests with their own sacred texts, the books they'd written, and a kind of orthodoxy, a creed, if you like, that all that exists is matter in motion and everything can be explained by it. And if you disagreed with that, if you broke ranks with them, if you were a heretic, then you could be excommunicated from this movement and rounded upon. In a sense, we're inherently religious, and even atheism can take on a quasi-religious tone. But there were also problems within the movement as well. It turned out that once they'd all agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, the new atheists actually had trouble agreeing on much else. I noticed this as a sort of interested bystander, that a lot of controversies started to multiply within the movement. There were people who felt that the fact the movement was essentially led by a phalanx of old white men was not good for diversity and so on. There was a group that wanted to go in a different direction and affirm things that we could be for rather than just the things they were against. Social justice, feminism, LGBT rights and so on. There was a group that wanted to take atheism in that direction. They called it atheism plus. But there was a strong reaction against that in the opposite direction. People who felt this was all just politically correct ideology taking over their free thought movement. And so it split down the centre. And those controversies continued to multiply to the point where even the leader of the movement, Richard Dawkins, was shunned and cancelled by people who had formerly bestowed honours upon him. For instance, the American Humanist Association in 2021, back in the 1990s, it had awarded Richard Dawkins their Humanist of the Year award. Well, they rescinded that in 2021. They stripped him of that award because of comments he'd made on transgender. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, the way that those hot-button cultural issues came to split the atheist movement just as they are splitting our culture as well. The new atheism was no exception to that trend. And what I've noticed is that, in a sense, the new atheism, as it unravelled internally, as it began to look a little bit shrill and dogmatic itself to many people around it, it essentially lost its steam. It sort of faded from public consciousness, and pretty much all of the architects of the new atheist movement today are no longer really talking about religion any longer. They've all taken sides in this culture war. What I did notice coming in the place of these intellectuals who had dismissed God and Christianity was a much more nuanced conversation on the God question, on the value of Christianity. And tonight I want to introduce you to some of the new, still often secular thinkers, but who are asking very different questions about the Christian faith. And I think we're living in a unique moment, that turning of the tide moment, where suddenly the atmosphere is changing and people are opening up in new ways to the possibility that there might be more to this life than just the material universe that we live in. And I want to do that in a particular way tonight. I want to run through three things that I think in our culture, in our world, are pointing towards rather than away from God, and about some of the people who I've met who are pointing in that direction as well. If I could get the next slide. I've written about this in both the books, so you're kind of getting a blend of a few different ideas tonight. Where we are currently in our culture, that's very much the theme of the white book there. The new one, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. But some of these ideas I'm going to be sketching out tonight are also contained in my first book, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists I'm Still a Christian, where I simply lay out my case for Christian faith against a sort of atheistic worldview. And here's how I'm going to do it. Following slide, if you would. I'm going to be asking, what's the best explanation? This series is titled, Why I Believe. And tonight I want to give you three reasons why I think it makes sense to believe in God. Because as I hosted these conversations between Christians and atheists over many years, I realised that everyone comes to life with a worldview, a way of looking at things. And sometimes it's possible for Christians to think, look, I'm a Christian here, believing in weird things like God and angels and heaven, and maybe it's my job to try and persuade everyone else of these funny beliefs. But actually, my atheist friend over here, they've got a way of looking at the world as well, and their views need defending just as much as mine do as a Christian, okay? Because an atheist, generally, the ones I've met, subscribe to something called naturalism. It's the idea that everything that exists can be explained by matter in motion, that the universe simply runs according to scientific laws. Electrons, chemicals, those ultimately explain everything that we experience. But that's got some consequences to it, because it means there's no ultimate purpose to the universe. It's sort of running according to the blind laws of nature. That things like beauty, truth, love, justice, right and wrong, they're all sort of things we've come up with as humans. They don't really exist in reality. Ultimately, everything, as I said, is chemicals and chemistry and atoms in motion. Now, that's got a lot of consequences, that worldview. And so when we're deciding, does it make sense to be an atheist or to be a Christian, we've got to look at both of these worldviews and say, well, which of those ways of looking at the world makes best sense of the evidence? And in my experience, the Christian story that there is a divine mind behind the universe, one which decided to come in person, makes a lot more sense of a lot of the evidence. It doesn't mean you've got a bulletproof argument, a knockdown proof for God, but what we're being asked to do is simply ask, well, which makes better sense? And I want to suggest that there are three ways that you can think about the world, the universe, and us, that I think are better explained by God. The first one is human existence. If we go to the next slide. I think God makes sense of human existence. Now, there's been this familiar mantra in the sort of debate over science and faith, especially from the new atheist side, that basically the more we know about science, about the world, about the universe, the less need we have for God, basically. But actually, when you really dig into the science, I think you'll find a different story being told. And the fact is, the more we know about our universe, its complexity, and what it took for us to be here, the more I think it's opening up the God question rather than closing it down. So early on in the course of my show, I was able to host a number of conversations between believing Christian scientists and atheist scientists. And one of the interesting phenomena that was often debated was something called the fine-tuning of the universe for life. Now, it's a bit of a complex idea, so a few years ago I tried to boil it down into a simple video that might help to bring across the extraordinary fact that you and I are here today. So I'm going to let the video do the talking for just a few minutes, and then I'll come back to the mic.
Some people say that human existence is a result of a roll of the cosmic dice. Like the gambler who stakes his life savings on the next throw, we just got lucky in the lottery of life. Some people say there's no purpose in the universe, no grand plan, no God behind it all. Our numbers just came up and here we are. But I don't believe them, and nor should you. If I roll this dice, the chances of getting a 6 is 1 in 6. That's not too bad. But what are the chances of me rolling 6 twice in a row? Well, the odds get longer. It's 1 in 6 times by 1 in 6. That's 1 in 36. So I'd have to be pretty lucky to get 2 6s in a row. Now, every time I add the chances of rolling another 6 in a row, the odds go up exponentially, and it gets even more unlikely. Now, what if I rolled this dice 70 times and every single time I got a 6? Okay, that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible, right? Well, in fact, the chances of rolling a 6 70 times in a row are around 1 in 10 to the 55. That's a 1 with 55 zeros after it. Now, just to put that in perspective, how long would I have to stand here rolling this dice, allowing about 5 seconds per roll, before hitting that lucky streak and rolling 76s in a row? Well, I had a mathematician friend work it out for me. On average, you would have to continually roll this dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years before your numbers come up. That's a long time. What if you applied that thinking to us? What are the odds of us being here? Now, the odds of rolling 76s in a row, 1 in 10 to the 55, as it happens, those are the same odds of something called the expansion rate of the universe being just right for the existence of us here today. From the moment of the Big Bang, when our universe began to rapidly expand, the rate of that expansion was exquisitely finely balanced. Any faster, and the universe would have expanded too rapidly to allow the formation of chemicals, atoms, stars, and galaxies. Any slower, and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. But as it happens, the universe expanded at just the right rate to allow for life to develop in the future, for us to be here. It hit 70 rolls of the number 6 in a row, first time. And the expansion rate of the universe is just one among 30 or so other incredibly sensitively finely tuned constants and fundamental forces in the universe that must be just the way they are for the universe to be able to produce us. So let's imagine, if I went ahead and rolled this dice 70 times, and what do you know, every time it came up 6. No waiting for trillions upon trillions of years, first time. Beginner's luck? Hardly. You would assume that I must have rigged it. Maybe the dice are loaded, maybe there are 6s on every side. It can't be chance. Now let me ask you, why would we assume that this universe with us in it, which is actually way more improbable than my 70 rolls, is just a result of chance? The fact that we're here shows that someone's loaded the dice. In fact, maybe there's no dice at all. What if the evidence points to this life-permitting universe actually being the product of an intelligent mind which intended for us to be here? Now, you could come up with some speculative other theory. Maybe there's an infinite number of universes, giving you an infinite number of chances to roll the dice. Maybe. But we don't have any scientific evidence for it. So if you're hanging your hat on that possibility, then you're every bit as much committed to a faith position as the person who says God was behind it. Believing in God isn't a delusion. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion when we look at the fingerprints on our universe. And if it's true that we aren't just the fluke result of a cosmic roll of the dice, and that we're actually here because a grand designer intended us from the very beginning, well, that's worth staking something on.
Phenomenon, isn't it? And I've noticed that more and more people are paying attention to all kinds of aspects of our universe that seem to be crying out for an explanation beyond the universe itself. Now, it's not just Christian thinkers who are putting these points across. In fact, there's lots of secular intellectuals and scientists who are also asking interesting questions. I'm going to show you a slide of someone called Paul Davies. Paul Davies has been a bit of a thorn in the side of many new atheists for many years because he's a very much a popularizer of science. He's written best-selling books. He's based at the University of Arizona. And he's very interesting because he has been remarking and researching on all the different ways in which we are it's just so striking that we're here at all and able to even ask these kinds of questions. The fact that, yes, the universe came into existence in a big bang some 14 billion years ago, that time, space and matter emerged from something, who knows what, that this fine-tuning exists that allows for organic life to even exist in the universe, but that not only did life begin, which is just nothing short of miraculous when you look at the complexity of a DNA molecule, but that it evolved into you and me, conscious beings who could not only feel and understand things, but reflect on themselves and start to ask questions like, well, why am I here? Where did I come from? This is the way Paul Davies put it to me in a conversation. He said, the directionality in the universe, going from matter to life to consciousness, I would add comprehension to that. There's an arrow in time in the direction of comprehension. And if that is the case, if this is not just an enormous fluke, a happy series of accidents, then that to me comes very close to something like a meaning or purpose in nature. I think, he said, that's a sort of religious feeling, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. Now again, Paul Davies isn't really a religious person, but he reaches for kind of religious language when he looks at what it took for us to be here. It doesn't fit well for Paul Davies with this naturalist atheist view of reality. Now I would reach for a Greek word in what Paul Davies is describing there. Logos, or logos, It means an organising principle that speaks life and meaning into chaos and disorder. That's what I think Paul Davies is observing in this kind of directionality towards us, towards consciousness, towards perception and comprehension. But of course, logos is the Greek word that was used for Jesus in the Gospels, speaking life, creating order out of the chaos. For me, there's an interesting overlap between the science, the best science being done today, and the way in which the Christian worldview talks about why we're here, the fact that we're here at all, and what it took for us to be here. So I think God is a better explanation for human existence than the atheist story of reality. The second point I want to make to you tonight is that God is the best explanation of human value. God makes sense of human value. Why do we believe in human rights? Why, some 75 years ago, did we come up with something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Why do we believe there are some very real rules about the way we should and shouldn't treat other human beings? Did we come up with these through science and reason? Is it just a sort of social contract that we've developed? I don't think so. I think this idea that there are human rights, that there are certain ways we should and shouldn't treat each other, that people have inherent value and dignity, this idea of equality between people no matter who they are, where they're from, what their background is, I don't think you can explain that on a purely scientific evolutionary basis. I think it goes deeper than that. And this was brought home to me in the very first conversation I had with Richard Dawkins. Got a photo of him there. As I said, very much the leader of the new atheist movement. And back in 2008, he had a public dialogue at Oxford University with John Lennox, who's going to be featured next year here in the Why I Believe series. And they had a fantastic discussion on God, obviously Richard Dawkins against the existence of God, John Lennox defending it from a scientific and philosophical perspective. And I managed to bag in the sort of after-show party a very brief interview with Richard Dawkins. I captured it for my show. And we had this really interesting moment in the conversation where we talked about this idea of human value and morality, and whether you could sort of justify it purely on science and evolution. And this is how it went. I'll read you it sort of word for word. I said to him, Richard, if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he answered, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine. We live in a society where selfishness, failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favours is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad that's a value judgment, glad that I live in such a society. And I said, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say, the reason this is good is that it's good, but you don't have any way to sort of stand on that statement? And he responded, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. I said, so therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that. In any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. To which I responded, okay, but ultimately your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And I think you could say that. And I think if you're a thoroughgoing atheist like Richard Dawkins, you should say that because he was being perfectly consistent with his worldview. The problem is we all instinctively recoil at the idea that our belief that rape is wrong is just the happenstance of the hand we happen to have been dealt with in our time and place by some socio-cultural evolutionary mechanism. It just happens that that's the way we think now, but could have been different, could have evolved in a different way. Why don't we believe that? Why do we believe there are actually some ways of treating other human beings that are really right and really wrong? I haven't found a satisfactory explanation on the atheist worldview. But on the Christian worldview, I think there is a very happy explanation. It's right there on the first page of the Bible, that humans are made in the image of God. If that's true, then that invests every human being, no matter who they are, with ultimate dignity and value. And that's where human rights, you can make sense of them. Because if we are made in the image of God, then of course we have this intrinsic dignity and value. But again, it's not just Christian thinkers who are making these arguments today. I've had some fascinating conversations with people like Tom Holland. Tom Holland is not the Marvel Spider-Man actor, I should say, but he is a well-known historian here in the UK, presents a fantastically popular podcast called The Rest is History, and has written a best-selling book called Dominion. But he's got a fascinating story of how in his own childhood, sort of a kind of childhood faith kind of sputtered out by his teenage years. But things started to change for him as he embarked on his career writing about the ancient world, because as he explored the world of the ancient Romans and Greeks, which he loved, he also realized that it was a very alien world to his way of thinking, because this was a world where slavery was simply an unquestionable part of the economy, where certain people could be sexual property, where life was cheap. Newborn children could be left out in the wild to be eaten by animals if they were simply not wanted, where the slaughter and enslaving of your enemies was considered a cause of celebration and triumph. And he realized that his own beliefs in human dignity and freedom and equality, they didn't come from the Greeks and the Romans. And he also realized they didn't really come from science and reason and the Enlightenment. He realized where they came from was a person called Jesus Christ. He realized that the Christian revolution 2,000 years ago had completely shaped everything he believed about the way you should think about life. And he realized, I'm not a Christian, but in almost every way, I am a Christian, because my assumptions, my moral instincts are inherently Christian. They didn't have to be this way. There's lots of other parts of the world where they don't share these moral instincts. There's lots of places in the world in the past where they didn't share this view. Why do we believe it today? Not because of atheism, not because of science, because of what Christianity told us about a God who came in person, died a sacrificial death, and told his followers to go and do likewise, lead lives of compassion, self-sacrifice, putting other people first. That's where these moral instincts come from, realized Tom Holland. And there's so many more people I'm bumping into. Even after I finished writing the book and sent it off to the publishers last year, I bumped into someone who's gone on a very similar journey to Tom Holland. Louise Perry is a really interesting person who's a journalist and a female rights advocate who wrote a fantastically interesting book just last year called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And she, purely from a sociological point of view, was asking, is the sexual revolution good for women? And she came to the conclusion that it's not, that the way people treat sex and relationships today, in the casual way that they're often used, is actually being against women in terms of their biology and their sort of social standing and so on. What was interesting was that by the end of the book, having gone through these very kind of just objective scientific arguments, Louise Perry came to some very Christian conclusions. She said, I've come to realize, essentially, that monogamous marriage, which was essentially an invention of the Christian West, is the best thing, the best container, if you like, for sexuality and relationships. And knowing Louise a little bit personally, I know that she has gone on a similar journey to Tom Holland, asking, well, is there more to this Christian story that seems to have sort of made sense of a lot of the things that I've been looking at? Again, these are secular people, but who are coming to oddly Christian conclusions. And I find that this pattern is emerging in lots of different spheres. So we've talked about God making sense of human existence, God making sense of human value, people like Louise Perry and Tom Holland realizing, yeah, where do those values come from? And why did Christianity produce this idea of a culture where we respect and treat people with equality and dignity? Human purpose, that's the final one I want to bring to you tonight. That God makes sense of human purpose, the why question. Why do we experience, across all times, places and culture, a kind of quest for transcendent meaning and purpose? Perhaps the most prominent of the new thinkers in this area is someone called Jordan Peterson. Now, Jordan Peterson is a Canadian psychology professor who rose to fame in 2018 and somehow was able to fill whole auditoriums with young people, especially young men, who just hung on his every word about how to live a meaningful, flourishing life, and used the Bible for a lot of the lessons that he was giving. Now, Jordan Peterson is a bit of a controversial pundit in the culture wars. But whatever you think of his politics, you can't ignore his influence as a cultural thinker over the last 5 years or so. Because Peterson, when he came on my show to discuss his approach, he described the new atheist as very shallow. He says we all need a story to live by, and the new atheists just didn't have a story to give people. They tore God down, but they didn't replace God with anything positive. He and many other psychologists have coined the phrase the meaning crisis in our culture. He says people don't have a story to live by anymore. And they're grabbing all kinds of other stories in the culture, but that aren't satisfying them. It's why we've got a mental health crisis, a lot of these psychologists believe. Now, Peterson himself, again, he's an interesting person because he seems to just pull shy of saying, I'm a Christian. The closest he came to it on the show that I interviewed him on was saying, well, I can't say I believe that God exists, but I live my life as though God exists, which was an interesting way of putting it. But wherever he stands on the issue, he's actually opening the door for a lot of other people to take Christianity seriously. This is someone who I would say has just as much, if not more, cultural clout today than Richard Dawkins ever had at the height of his new atheist fame. But Jordan Peterson is actually opening the door to Christianity rather than shutting it for many people. I know people who have become Christians because they started watching Jordan Peterson videos. Now, I'm not saying he's the new Messiah and he's going to bring, a Christian revolution, but he is asking interesting questions. He's asking, can we actually live without something like God in our lives? And in some of his most honest moments, after about a year-long battle with a serious illness that he was recovering from, he had a conversation with a friend of his, Jonathan Pajot, who's an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And Peterson actually struggled to contain his emotions as he spoke of his own sort of religious longings. He said, almost in tears, he described his comprehension that the objective world of history and fact, and the narrative world, as he calls it, of myth and meaning, which he's so invested in as a psychologist, how they seem to come together for him in the person of Jesus Christ. This is the person who seems to be able to bring those two worlds together. He said, I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Well, I think Jordan Peterson is still working out his faith in public in that sense. But the good news for you and me and for Jordan Peterson is that there is a source, I believe, of meaning. That we're not simply inventing these things in the dark, that there is someone at the center of life and the universe who can give us that purpose, that meaning that so many people are looking for in their lives. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, a baby feels hungry. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. People feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. And he said, if I feel in myself a desire which nothing in this world can satisfy, the answer is that I was made for another world. Could it be that desire we all experience, and people in every time, place and culture experience, for something more than just the span of this, 70 years or whatever we may get on earth, and then it's lights out? People want more than that. And the reason I think they want that, they desire that, is because there's something that can meet that. The remarkable thing about the Christian story is that there is a person, I believe, at the center of it who meets all of those searches for meaning and purpose. And I want to introduce you to one more interesting thinker who's gone on a journey herself just recently in this respect. This is Molly Worthen. I met Molly just this year. And Molly is a noted historian of North American religion. She works at the University of North Carolina. And for the past 20 years or more has essentially been an agnostic. She'd been reporting on religion. She knew the good, the bad, and the ugly of Christianity in America. But to her own great surprise, and the surprise of many people who followed her writing in various journals and newspapers, last year she became a Christian. She was baptized. And she might be the last person you would think would become a Christian. She has seen, as I say, the worst of American politicized Christianity. She sort of shares a university with one of the leading skeptical scholars of the Bible, Bart Ehrman. You know, she goes to lunch with him. And yet she, a thinking, intelligent, 21st century person with every reason to doubt or disbelieve the Christian story, has come to faith. What changed it for Molly Worthen? Well, I'll tell you, it was a pastor that she had been asked to interview for a newspaper, who, during the course of her interviewing him, said to her, "What about you, Molly? What do you believe?" And he challenged her to get off the agnostic fence and to look into the historical claims of Christianity. Were the things that the New Testament said about Jesus verifiable? Could it be true? She decided to take him at his word, and she looked into it. And that took her on an interesting journey, engaging with some big thinkers. She ended up in an email correspondence with N.T. Wright, a well-known New Testament historian who's published some big books on the history of the early church. She ended up having a conversation with Tim Keller, who passed away just this year, but was another significant Christian thinker. And in the process, as she started to put the pieces of the puzzle together, she realized there really was a strong historical core at the center of the Christian faith. That you couldn't make sense of what happened 2,000 years ago when these very religious Jewish people suddenly started claiming that someone had risen from the dead and was the Messiah, without seeing a resurrection-shaped hole at the center of that story. That led her down a journey to realizing that the meaning and the purpose that she had been looking for was found not in a political ideology or a philosophy, but in a person, Jesus Christ. And I believe today that we are given that option too. The psychologists, in fact, tell us that there are two things humans need to lead a flourishing life. They need love and they need hope. I don't see that being delivered by the atheist story of reality. I just don't, because ultimately the story of reality in the atheist worldview is that the universe is running out of energy, and one day everything we ever hoped, dreamt or longed for will be forgotten in a sterile, cold, dead universe. Now maybe that's what will happen, who knows, but it's not the kind of thing that ultimately gives people hope. But the Christian story holds out love and hope with both hands, because it's a story of a God who came and in a supreme act of sacrificial love gave himself for the worst people. And it's a story of hope because it's a God who also rose from the grave and invites everyone into a new life. For me, that is a story that can give people purpose, meaning, hope, and identity. It's something everyone is looking for. The new atheism failed to deliver on that. I believe the Christian story has always delivered on that. That's why I think there are three good reasons why God makes best sense of these things: human existence, human value, and human purpose. I'm always open to conversations, though, with those who disagree. That's why I think we need, as Christians, if you call yourself a Christian here tonight, you need to be open to having these conversations with people who don't share your worldview. It's so important that we don't just write each other off because we hold different perspectives, but that we have that respectful, mutual dialogue. But I'm also excited, speaking as a Christian, that there seems to be a change in the atmosphere, a turning of the tide, as I see these interesting intellectuals starting to open up the Christian story again. I wonder whether we might see that story start to come back, perhaps as a tidal wave one day in our culture, because people are still looking for a story to live by. And the Christian story is there. I believe it's the only story that can make sense of all our other stories. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you. Well, I've gone on for a long time. So are we going to have a quick stretch of the legs, Sam? Brilliant. And then we'll 3 minutes, and we'll come back in 3 minutes. So have a chance to do what you need to do, and I look forward to your questions in 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to make the most of the time that we have, and get in as many questions as we can. I'm going to be the microphone runner, so if you just raise your hand or give me a wave, I will run over and take the microphone to you, and let's get the questions coming in. You first.
I'm Katie, and I'm also a radio presenter.
Great.
So I was just wondering if your show was on a local radio station instead of like primary Christian radio, would that be a difference in the way that you were presenting it, and would it involve more people from like the audience?
Yeah,
debate going on?
It's a good question. So as it happens, I no longer present the show. Actually, I did move on from presenting it after 17 and a half years just a few months ago. But it still continues, both on radio and as a podcast, video show, and so on. I think probably it would almost have been hard to start such a show on a purely secular station, because in a sense, I think the fact that every week I was kind of having a Christian voice opposite the non-Christian voice might be seen as too one-sided, even having both sides represented. But it was quite revolutionary in the Christian space, because often it was just Christians you would hear in that space. So I think it is important to bring both sides together. I think one of the best sort of compliments I could ever receive from people who listened was I had to listen for a few weeks, Justin, before I worked out that you were a Christian, because actually I'm glad, because I wanted to be a kind of neutral presence. I wanted both sides to have their say and not feel that I was directing it or making them come to a conclusion. So I think there could be a case that could work well on a secular sort of station. I don't see why not necessarily. Perhaps you know of one and we could get it going, who knows. But thank you, and great to know you're working in that field.
Brilliant. Next question.
Hi, Justin. First of all, I think you did the whole presentation really well. Laid out a really good argument, I think. The question I wanted to ask was, what motivates you personally to come to somewhere like Aylesbury and to do this kind of apologetic?
Well, Sam is very persuasive, first of all. But no, I, in a sense, I do feel, in a sense, just to go in the God direction, that I have a calling on my life. I've been given the privilege of moderating a lot of these discussions for over a decade and a half. And I do feel a burden that actually there's a real hunger for, especially thinking people, as you all must be for coming to a series like this, to kind of grapple with the big questions, and that actually Christianity can meet them. I've discovered in the course of doing this show that actually there's a real intellectual backbone to Christianity, and that it's fine for it to be out in the public sphere engaging, and it just sort of fires me. So that's what I feel God's called me to. That's what motivates me to come and share it with you guys.
Next question.
I like your analogy about the tide coming back in, and I don't think there's a doubt that the tide will come back in, but my concern is that it won't be not pushing away the secular sand flats, so to speak, but more it'll be like Abrahamic religions besides Christianity. So I noticed you addressed secularism, but you didn't really address other religions like the Abrahamic.
Islam and Judaism,
the decline in the West and the amount of immigration that's happening into the West from Africa and South America, bringing the Muslim religion and Catholicism, and I'd just like you to speak into, if you would, just
what that tide might look like.
How to address that. And how that could be a concern. Because obviously that's not including Jesus.
Sure. Well, what I would say is that G.K. Chesterton once said, when people stop believing in Christianity, they don't believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. And I've heard other people say in like manner, that returning tide, it might not necessarily be the Christian story, Justin. It might be what a lot of people are actually reaching for these days. All kinds of new age beliefs and quasi-spiritual, ideologies. And it could be, Islam, it could be other things that are obviously appealing to people who are trying to make sense of life in that sense. Obviously, I believe that the West in particular, where we are living in this post-Christian world, it has been uniquely shaped by the Christian story. And again, if you read someone like Tom Holland, you'll see just how particularly the West just still has that Christian undercurrent going on. A lot of the basic assumptions about life and about morality are essentially Christian ones that aren't necessarily shared by other worldviews, Islam and so on, ultimately. And so to that extent, I think the key is whether we want the benefits of the Christian worldview in the end, in the West. It could go in a different direction. If the secularist sort of movement continues, it could go in a very different direction. If Islam makes big inroads into the West, then obviously that will have its own effects as well. Ultimately, I guess my belief that the Christian story will ultimately be the thing that wins out is because I'm a Christian. It's because I believe that God is still working through his church. And even though we often see the church as sort of often divided and impotent in so many ways, actually the church has always had this kind of up and down over the centuries, where it looks like Christianity's kind of falling away because, you know, the faith of a previous generation calcifies into a sort of nominalism, and then suddenly something surprising happens and you get a Wesley or a Whitfield or something that kind of suddenly the spirit breaks out and the church is alive again. I think we're in one of those moments where this post-Christian secular age has kind of convinced everyone that that's the story, and perhaps something else like Islam could be the future in the West. But I think God is in the habit of surprising us, and that there's all kinds of things going on, even in the Islamic world, which are often underreported, that suggest that something else is happening. I've really focused in my talk and my book on the West, but I think Christianity, there's all kinds of interesting stories in the way that it's coming to influence other parts of the world as well in surprising ways. So in that sense, I do believe in a church that will actually respond at some point to what God is doing. I can't predict what that will look like between now and then. We will continue to obviously have to engage with what a pluralistic, multicultural society looks like. And that's okay, because the first Christians were in exactly the same boat 2,000 years ago. They were about 120 people who lived in a highly pagan, not just a post-Christian, a pre-Christian culture. And we're kind of living in the same world now. Some people say we're not even post-Christian, we're pre-Christian, we're so far down the road. But that's okay, because God does surprising things. So I don't get too worried about all the other potential stories that might be coming in the wake of the kind of secularist void that's been left behind, because I kind of have a faith through what I'm seeing and just through being a Christian who believes God's purposes will be done, that actually the Christian story will be the one that ultimately makes sense to the world.
Good question. Any question is open, or questions on the table? So who's got the next one? I'll go to you, then I'll come to you.
Paul Carter. Israel was supposed to be a light to the nation. I think probably most of us here would agree they failed. And the church was supposed to be a light, go into all the world and preach the gospel. And do you think that the fact that these ups and downs have happened is perhaps, dare I say, because the church is not out there, but I hesitate to say here because any church, I don't want to be stoned. Do you think that in effect, up to now, the church has failed to be out there and preaching the gospel in this country, not so much in some others?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a truth to that. I think sometimes the church can try to be so relevant sometimes in a culture that it becomes almost irrelevant. And the only way you can be a light to the culture is by shining in a way that marks you as different. One of the interesting things, as I've spoken to a lot of these secular thinkers who are kind of interested in Christianity, might even be thinking of setting foot in church, is that one thing they've often said is, please keep Christianity weird. Now that sounds strange, but what they mean is, if you want to attract me back to church and to the Christian story, don't water it down. Don't make it kind of a warmed over secular humanism. don't make it sort of just another version of what I can already get in the culture, basically. And a lot of these, people who are on that journey or who have even become Christians have often gone to the quite sort of mystical end of the spectrum. They're going for the kind of very high Anglo-Catholic or Eastern Orthodox form of Christianity, because they feel like that is almost otherworldly. It gives them a mystery, a sense of kind of, a different story of reality. And I think that's often what people are looking for in our culture, something very different. And the worst thing we could do as Christians is just to kind of, I think, yes, stay in our holy huddles, or just when we are out in the culture, just be so bland that no one could ever tell that we believed anything distinctive. And so for me, I think that's the challenge for the church. How do we be that light that we are called to be in our culture? Because I think people are starting to open up with these questions again. They're looking for meaning and purpose. And sometimes, with the fear of giving offence, we sometimes perhaps don't give the kinds of answers that actually Jesus is calling us to, that sometimes are challenging, sometimes make us look weird, but ultimately, Christianity was very weird when it began 2,000 years ago. It was bizarre that these Jewish people would claim that God had become human and died the death of a rebellious slave. You couldn't have had a weirder religion, but it became the thing that transformed the world. So we need to be prepared to kind of be seen as a bit weird, because ultimately that's the way God transforms culture.
Thanks very much, Justin, for a really helpful evening and talk. It's been great. And I agree with you that people are more wanting to engage in the big questions. Now, as a Christian involved in the media, they don't really think that the sort of Christian broadcasting or religious broadcasting doesn't really seem to be picking up on this. Why is that?
So is the question sort of why isn't the religious sort of broadcasting asking these kinds of questions of these folk? I think sometimes it's because the church, sadly, is often a little bit behind the curve, frankly. I think often the church is answering the questions that people had 20 years ago. So I do run into a lot of ministries, and there's still important work to be done in addressing those new atheist objections, but those aren't, for me, actually the questions that most people are asking today. Most people aren't asking, can you show me God exists? Give me the evidence, as the new atheists were. They're actually asking something like, how do I make sense of life enough to be able to get out of bed in the morning because I'm feeling depressed? It's a very existential kind of way in which people are thinking about life, and probably that's where we need to begin as Christians. And so yes, to some extent I think it is important for the church, Christian media, wherever, to be actually addressing where people are, and that may be just about having our ear to the ground a little bit more in terms of what's going on in our culture. I also think that in the end, Christian media itself is a limited thing. It can only do what it can do, and usually it's speaking to like-minded people. My show was a bit of an exception to that because we drew a very diverse audience, especially on podcast and video. So I think what's really important is actually that Christians are not just being Christians in Christian media, but Christians in media generally, that we're actually, that light is being spread in all kinds of spheres. Because ultimately I think that's what will make a difference. If you can, in your sphere of influence, start to show what that story looks like and how it's different to the prevailing culture around us, then that's the most powerful witness I think we can have ultimately. So I think it's about Christians being more imaginative as well in it actually engaging our culture at present. Sometimes we limit ourselves as to what God could do, but I think we need to dream big and maybe start some new media ventures that aren't just quote unquote Christian, but actually reach out in different ways.
Start your TikTok accounts and your YouTube channels.
It's one way of doing it.
Hello, Justin. As a parent, I've always noticed that the school's not very involved in, they don't show children enough. I don't think they don't do enough in religious education. And I know you've been to the United States many times. I wonder if you have ever been to something called classical Christian school, because that's something that's been, I think they've been doing it in America for 30 years. 30 years.
So,
I wonder, because I've been checking over here if there's any school like that. And I think a couple of years ago, one started when they taught classical, religion and Latin. And I just thought it was fascinating, but there was only one. And now there's another one trying to start. They haven't found a building in St. Albans. And I don't know, do you know anything about it?
well, I don't know a great deal about it, though I would agree with you that there is a bit of a tragedy that we have lost almost just the basic language of the Christian culture that obviously informed, our country and so much of the West. Because in a sense, I think there's been a move to say, well, we shouldn't privilege Christianity, and I understand why people think that. But that means you end up not really getting to grips with the main story that has shaped your own. So I can see why there's been a move, especially in the States, to that sort of classical Christian education. And I know that, for instance, homeschooling is a much bigger thing in the US, where a lot of Christians feel, no, I need to have a different way of inculcating Christian values into. I mean, what's different here is that we do have, in a sense, still a lot of state-funded church schools, which have an ethos, so that, Catholic or Anglican primary schools and secondary schools. But even there, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to potentially really have a distinctively Christian perspective on things. And even there, my children go to, a great school, but one where, they as kids who go to church are somewhat unusual, even at the Anglican school in that sense. But I don't know what the answer is to that. All I know is that I speak to a lot of people who are also very aware that we're losing something in our culture as we lose just that basic familiarity with the Christian story. Even someone like Richard Dawkins, funnily enough, he helped to fund a campaign to put the King James Bible into every school library, because even he recognized that the Bible is a kind of foundational literary document, if nothing else, for Western culture. And so even as a new atheist, he was willing to sort of fund a campaign like that. And I think just at that level, it would make sense for education to take the inheritance of Christianity more seriously, because we are seriously losing something if we don't have that. And I would love, obviously, to see that more and more schools, and whether it be independent ones that come through, helping people to understand that heritage, but also to show why education was a Christian invention as well. This idea that everyone should be able to have the opportunity to learn and to experience knowledge and so on is absolutely an inheritance of the Christian West. So yeah, in short, I agree. It would be good to see that going in that direction, but it's a complex situation, obviously, here in the UK.
Hi, Justin. So the question is, what do you think happens to those who don't believe in this life and when they die?
Wow, okay. So I believe the best thing you can do in this life is to become a follower of Jesus Christ and accept his gift of salvation. I think sometimes we have made the Christian story, somewhat reductive, though, just to a sort of will I get to heaven when I die or not kind of story. And actually, something I've learned in the process of having a lot of these conversations, and especially being influenced by Christian thinkers like N.T. Wright, is that actually the Christian story is much bigger than that, just that reductive thing. It's about the renewing of the whole of creation. It's not just a kind of will I get to heaven sort of story. But I do believe that, that personal decision to follow Christ is an important part of that story. And I hope that every person comes to that knowledge of God. What happens to those who don't? I'm the kind of person who's willing to say, I'm not the judge of that, God is, okay? I believe in the end that God will do justly by everyone, so that no one on that final day will be able to say, I was treated unfairly. But God's far better at making that call than I ever will be. So I prefer not to put myself in that position of saying, well, that person's in and that person's out. In the end, I believe that what we're being invited to in the Christian story is to become part of God's kingdom. Now, what that leads me to believe is that in the end, not everyone will want to be in that kingdom. I'm not a universalist in that sense. I don't believe that sort of everyone will get in, because surely, if heaven was on offer, wouldn't everyone choose that? I don't think everyone wants God to be king of their lives. And even in the fullness of time, I think there are people who, even if they saw God face to face, would say, that's not what I want. What does God do with someone who ultimately rejects him, who doesn't accept that gift, if you like? I think what ultimately happens is that person is cut off from God, from the source of life. I have a slightly different perspective on this than some Christians. So the word hell means different things to different people. For some people, that means a state of what's sometimes called eternal conscious torment, the idea that there's an everlasting kind of judgment or punishment for those who ultimately reject God. That's not the way I actually think the Bible ultimately spells out hell. I think there is some kind of a kind of punishment or judgment in the sense of people sort of realizing what they've lost in that sense. But ultimately, I think what the Bible speaks of is a kind of a final end to those who ultimately reject God. That because you cut yourself off from God, the source of life, you effectively, as C.S. Lewis puts it, you've closed the doors from the inside. And for me, that makes more sense both the way the Bible talks about hell, or Gehenna as it's often actually in the Greek in the New Testament. And it also makes more sense from a philosophical perspective, that actually there isn't this continuing state for people, that ultimately those who choose to reject God are ultimately it's God saying, thy will be done. So for me, that's my best understanding of what ultimately happens. But as I said, that's why I think is the ultimate story for those who ultimately choose that. But I'm not here to judge who that will be in that sense. I'm very open to the idea that God will surprise us in all kinds of ways with the people who ultimately would say yes to God in the final analysis. So that's kind of where I stand on that one.
We've got time for one more question. But you didn't want yours to be the last question.
No.
Yes, I'll go to Pastor Kane at the back.
Thank you. I engage with a lot of young people and speak to young people, and as we see here, most of the people here have a few more miles under the belt. I'm just trying to say this.
That was a really diplomatic way of putting it.
One of the challenges in speaking to young people is not that they've really thought about these things and come to the conclusions that some of these new atheists do, is that they don't think at all. And how do you think we should or can engage with the young people more than just on an individual basis to get them to think enough to realise that I actually need to ask these questions?
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question and a good place to probably finish, because in the end, I think that's the bigger problem. Sometimes the new atheism, in a way, was a bit of a gift to me and to the Christian church, because it got people talking about God. When those bus campaigns were, going around saying there's probably no God, I was like, hurrah, because probably most of the people reading that had never even thought about God. So I'd rather they were kind of challenged with this idea there's no God than just to kind of be completely apathetic. I think that the bigger problem is people who just aren't interested in the question one way or the other. And for me, the challenge then is probably where you're going to start with a young person who just doesn't show much interest in the question, is not by saying, well, do you believe in God? Because they might not even have a concept of God to begin with. It's maybe something they've never really taken the trouble to think about. And they'll maybe just see, oh, it's another of those funny RE questions I get at school. I think the place to start with a young person is, well, what does turn you on? What are your interests? What are you passionate about? Because more often than not, you'll find there's something that a young person really cares about. It might be sport, it might be music, it might be some kind of social cause, it might be environmentalism. Whatever it is, there's probably something that a young person does find they are interested in, that they're not apathetic about. And I think the challenge for us, if you like, as people who want to share the message of God, of Christ, is how do you start at where their story is, and how do you show them that in the end it's a reflection of a much bigger story of a God who actually cares about the things they care about, and that the thing they care about probably only really makes sense if there is a God underneath that big story. So if it was someone, who said, look, what I really care about is music. I want to be in a band. I'm really into this genre of music. I'd say, where do you think that comes from? What is it about music that inspires you so much? And do you think I've heard it said that music is just basically sound waves hitting your ears, forcing kind of, electrons to move around in your brain, and it's just a kind of experience in your head. Do you think that explains it? And that might be the start of a conversation where someone starts to ask, well, why does music move me so much? Why do I feel energized? And who knows where that could go, And I think it's about actually taking the time, not to just sort of think, I need to get to the gospel with this person, but to say, where can I start with this person? What interesting questions can I ask them that might facilitate a conversation that ultimately ends in talking about God and talking about Jesus? But often it's going to be some way down the road, and it's about forming the relationships with people and taking that genuine interest in their life rather than just seeing them as a sort of project to be evangelized. So that's where I would begin. I'm not the expert though, you are, so you should probably be the one answering that question, but thank you for it.
Let's, sorry.
Do you want to just quickly pop the mic over to her?
What comes to my mind, how do we start with young people? I think with lots of things in life, I wonder if we all have to be a bit more imaginative.
Yes, imagination. Well, funnily enough, that's the note I end the new book on. Imagination, the importance actually, not just of kind of giving logical, evidence-based answers, but actually people really respond to the imagination. Why do people turn out to watch Harry Potter and the Marvel movies, and basically lots of tales about magic and superpowers in a world where we think everything is purely explainable in purely natural terms? It's because the imagination still fires us, and that's, I think, where sometimes we miss it. Christians need to be better at inspiring people's imagination as well as answering their questions.
Can we give Justin a big... as good a night as I have. Justin will be back here next month with Sir Colin Humphreys, but he'll be in the host and interviewer chair that time. I hope to see you next month on October the 4th when we have the incredible Sir Colin Humphreys here, who will be walking us through his amazing story and journey and work and the place that God has had in that. He was knighted by the Queen in 2010 for his services to science and to the UK. He's got a lot to share. But bring a friend or family member. It's been great seeing this place this full tonight. We'd like to have it even more full. These conversations deserve to be heard by a lot more people. I'll just say we will put it on YouTube so you can watch it again. If you have a question for Justin that didn't get asked, you'll see more of him in Aylesbury in the coming months throughout this year. Right now, we will say goodnight, but the doors are not going to be closed. Justin will be at the table where Anne is out in the entranceway. We'll be selling his books, and you can get them signed here as well. Why don't you buy one for yourself and one for a friend to pass it on? Thank you so much for being here tonight. If you don't have all the dates, do grab a card on the way out. If you want to support us to make these events happen even more, and bring more of this sort of thing to Aylesbury, there's some sheets which have got our details and a QR code on them. Do grab that as well. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. It's been a wonderful evening, and have a safe journey home.
Thank you.